Hello there, it's Oscar at the virtual Fechtschule. Now, last time when I did a handout video like this, for some reason it got a lot more views than it had any right to. Now, granted, those were mostly people who had never even heard of HEMA before and were mostly very disappointed that I wasn't swinging a greatsword in my three-piece suit. If this video somehow blows up again, I'll do it though. I'm sure I won't live to regret saying that. There are of course also plenty of people who are just really happy to get an opportunity to get a look at the contents of one of my workshops. So let's just do that again. This weekend I will be at Fechtschule Bruges and we'll be doing a workshop on Paurenfeyndt's Messer plays. Messer in and of itself is of course already very interesting, but let's make the goal of this workshop just a little bit more interesting than that even. We're going to be working with Paurenfeyndt's Messer on two different levels. First off, we're going to be working with trying to bring separate pieces of techniques together into longer sequences, and after that we'll also be trying to use Paurenfeyndt's Messer as a way of learning about multiple one-handed weapons, ranging from side swords to katzbalgers, etc. Paurenfeynd, being a seasoned bodyguard, was trying to teach beginning fencers some very basic techniques. So give them separate pieces of techniques and will allow them to string these together as they please. That's at least the theory. And furthermore, he separated the book in several categories of different weapons. So there's the longsword, there's the messer, there's the staff, and there's also a bunch of plays he copied on sword and buckler from Licknitzer, but we'll just leave these out for now. Because the longsword might teach a beginning fencer not just how to do longsword, but also how to wield the beanhander or a greatsword. Staff is of course representative of not just staff, but also boar spear, halberd and pike. And finally, of course, the messer could represent any one-handed weapon. And he has a very long list that he doesn't even complete for brevity's sake. One of the things we're going to be looking at, of course, today is seeing how inclusive that list is. Could we do that with a katzbalger? Could we do it with a side sword? Let's find that out. Of course, a good training session starts with a warm-up, so I always like to include something to get the heart rate up, then some mobilization for the joints, and of course finally some stretches, especially for those areas that us modern desk-bound humans seem to be very tight in. Now, take especially good care to loosen up the wrists though for this, because if you mess up a sequence it might hit your wrist really hard. Having them properly loosened up might mitigate this a bit, so don't skip that. Having warmed up, let's go over some of the basics of Paurenfeynd. Thankfully, the man himself saw fit to write down 12 basic rules that beginning fencers should always keep in mind. The second half of those rules is mostly taken from earlier Lichtenauer sources, so if you do German longsword or have been practicing Leclerc's Messer, these should already be familiar to you. And they mostly cover the tactical aspects of a fight. As such, we'll leave them aside for now, because I specifically like to focus on the first 5 because those are very much about basic movement. 1. Bend the front knee but keep the rear leg straight. 2. Keep your body upright. 3. Coordinate your steps and strikes. 4. Don't overcommit your cuts. And 5. Know about the flat of your blade and don't fence with your non-dominant hand. Overall, we get this idea that Paurenfeynd really wants beginners to focus on their stance and structure and not make things too complicated straight away. So, for instance, stepping with your cut is the best way to generate power and also allowing you to let that cut flow through without having to completely overcommit that cut, leaving you very open. So, having said all that, it's time to pick up the weapons and actually start playing. So, here's a completed sequence that I cobbled together from several Stücke or pieces. This might be a bit complicated to learn in one go, so we break it up into separate pieces. This first piece involves a back edge parry and a cut to the wrist with a triangle step out to the side. We start with our right leg in front, keep it bent with the rear leg straight, right, and with the messer in a low position. Now, if our partner makes a cut towards our head from above, like so, then we instantaneously step out, meaning that we step out with the rear leg to the side of where our front leg is. Meanwhile, we parry with the short edge of our weapon, and then while we cut back, we set the back leg to once again come into this balanced stance that Paurenfeynd wants us to take. This is called a triangle step. Of course, you can make a variation where you start with your left leg in front and use a cross step or a false step. This is possible, it's just a bit more complicated on the footwork, a bit more difficult to pull off, so I'll include this for variation's sake. The second piece follows from the end position of the previous one. So from here, again, our partner gives us a cut from their right side from above, and we're going to be using a hanging parry to deflect that, and at the same time, again, using the triangle step to step out. For variation, you can of course again include the full step here, but there's another very fun variation, and that's the maiming thrust. It basically involves when your opponent cuts at you, you directly thrust at their hand, like so. Now, granted, this will take some getting used to, and also it was more likely meant to be used either against a horseman or when you are seated at a table and your opponent is standing higher than you, but still it's a very fun one to include. Now, we take a step back to admire our handiwork, and to our great surprise, our opponent still keeps attacking us. Well, we know what to do. We have the point down, the left leg in front, and if they come again with the cut, we sweep it up and immediately thrust forward with that. Now, as a variation, you could of course also do a winding cut, which is also a lot of fun. The next piece assumes that we start from a cut, which is what we ended the previous piece with. And if that thrust is parried, we can of course strike around to the other side. And if that one again is parried, we can make a very tightly executed small cut in front to the side that we attacked first. And finally, we step back into a left hanging point guard. Now, if our opponent would decide to cut at us from below against that guard, we can of course clip their wings, meaning that we step in, blocking their cut with our blade against their arm, and then also at the same time pushing against their shoulder. This works best of course when they're mid-step, because that will completely push them off to the side. And there we have it, a full combination of different cuts and thrusts, different pieces to form one full sequence. Now of course it doesn't mean that you have to combine these pieces in this sequence exactly. You can start playing with these sequences and form a different sort of combination. Here's but one other example, for instance. For now though, this is what we're working with, and we're going to turn it up to 11 by picking up the nearest steel weapon we have at hand. Of course, I have no way of predicting what's going to happen for you because I don't know what steel weapon you have just picked up, but I can of course describe how this changed the dynamic for me and Mila. So Mila is using steel Dussack, and I'm using what Adam from Landscape Emporium has started calling a proto-Katzbalger, which is pretty much just an early version of a Katzbalger hilt, and in this case on a relatively long and narrow blade. One thing that we of course noted was a different length. In the first play, it wasn't actually that hard with a wooden Dussack to attack Mila's hand, and in the second play you could generally reach the head a lot better, but with the steel weapons we found that the complex hilt and greater length made that a lot more difficult, a lot less reliable, so to speak. At the same time, having slightly bigger and also heavier blades means that recovering after the cut becomes more important. So you're much more reliant on good structure if you are going to be doing this with steel, which is also a very good lesson, of course. And finally, of course, my proto-Katzbalger is just longer than my partner's weapon, meaning that the thrusts just become a lot more potent. Trying to find out where your weapon has an advantage and where it has a disadvantage is of course also very interesting. The way in which steel weapons will affect this sequence is of course heavily dependent on, for instance, the length, the weight, and whether you are using symmetric or asymmetrical weapon combinations. But this is where your martial journey of discovery truly begins, of course. We've only scratched the surface of Paurenfeynd though, so there's plenty more to discover. With this workshop though, you should have what you need to start discovering for yourself. You now know that you can string these different pieces together into larger sequences that are more like what you can encounter in actual fighting or sparring. And you also know that what Paurenfeynd teaches you is applicable to almost any one-handed weapon of the day. With that, you should have what you need to dive in further and get a ton of good stuff out of Paurenfeynd. So let me know what you think in the comments below. How did it go trying to adapt this stuff from Paurenfeynd to other weapons? How did it go with your Kriegsmesser, your Katzbalger, or your side sword? Let me know in the comments down below. And while you're at it, don't forget to leave a like on this video and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. And finally, of course, a quick word about Patreon, because this is a really fun way to support the channel, as my patrons have already graciously decided to do. And of course, you get access to a couple of really cool perks. Anyway, having all said that, enjoy training, and I'll catch you all for the next one, and I'll say just this, okay doei.